The fastest way to expose a cruel man is to give him someone powerless to stand in front of. Rain hammered the windows of the Quick Mart on South Halsted Avenue just after midnight, turning the neon beer signs into blurry streaks of blue and red across the soaked pavement outside. Most people inside the store barely looked up from their coffee cups when Officer Daniel Hayes walked through the automatic doors, but the tension followed him anyway, cold and sharp, like winter air slipping under a doorway. Daniel carried himself with the kind of confidence that made people move aside before he even spoke. 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad shoulders under a dark Chicago police jacket, jaw tight, eyes always searching for someone weaker than him to control. The cashier immediately straightened up. A teenager near the soda machine quietly lowered his phone. Near the back aisle, a woman in a worn gray coat stood alone beside the medicine shelf, carefully comparing 2 bottles under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Evelyn Carter looked ordinary enough to disappear in a crowd. Mid-50s, hair pulled neatly back, low heels damp from the rain outside. Her coat sleeves were slightly frayed near the wrists, and tiny droplets of water still clung to the fabric from the storm. In one hand, she carried a small pack of cold medicine and a bottle of water. In the other, a thick red folder tied shut with faded string. Daniel noticed her immediately. Maybe it was because she stayed calm while everyone else looked nervous around him. Maybe it was because she didn't lower her eyes when he stared at her. "You gonna pay for that?" he asked loudly, his voice cutting across the store. Several customers turned to look. Evelyn blinked once, confused at first, then lifted the medicine slightly. "I was heading to the register." Daniel stepped closer. The rubber soles of his boots squeaked against the wet tile floor. "Funny thing about thieves," he said with a smirk. "They always say that after they get caught." A few people laughed nervously, more out of fear than amusement. Evelyn glanced toward the cashier, who immediately looked away. The old refrigerator motors hummed behind them. Rain tapped against the glass doors. "Officer," Evelyn said softly, "you're making a mistake." Daniel's smile widened at the sound of her calm voice. He hated calm people. Calm people made him feel challenged. "Oh, I don't think so." Before she could respond, he reached for her coat, grabbing the front roughly enough for the old zipper to split open with a sharp tearing sound that echoed through the store louder than anyone expected. Silence fell instantly. A bottle of pills slipped from her pocket and rolled across the tile floor. Then a silver fountain pen. Then the red folder hit the ground beside her shoes with a heavy thud. Evelyn inhaled sharply from the cold air hitting her chest through the torn fabric, but she never raised her voice, never stepped back. She simply crouched slowly to pick up the folder while Daniel stared down at her like he had already decided who she was. "You people always got some excuse," he muttered. Evelyn paused for one quiet second, rainwater dripping from the edge of her sleeve onto the floor. Then she looked up directly into his eyes and said, almost gently, "Daniel Hayes." That name already appeared in 3 federal complaints. The smile on his face disappeared. The air inside the Quick Mart suddenly felt smaller after Evelyn spoke his name. Daniel Hayes stared at her without blinking, his fingers still gripping the edge of the torn gray coat, while rainwater dripped steadily from the fabric onto the white tile floor. Somewhere near the coffee station, a machine beeped softly because someone had forgotten to remove their cup, but nobody moved to stop it. The entire store had gone quiet in the strange way people do when they sense something changing but do not yet understand what it is. Daniel finally let go of her coat with a short laugh that sounded forced even to himself. "Federal complaints," he repeated loudly. "Lady, you watch too many crime shows." A few nervous chuckles followed from the customers standing near the front counter, though none of them sounded convincing anymore. Evelyn slowly picked up the silver fountain pen from the floor first, carefully wiping a drop of dirty water from its cap with the sleeve of her coat. Her hands were steady. That bothered Daniel more than anger would have. Most people became emotional around him. Defensive, afraid, loud. But this woman acted like she had already seen worse things than public humiliation inside a convenience store after midnight. She retied the red folder calmly while the cold air from the broken zipper opening moved through her coat. Daniel noticed her fingers trembling slightly from the temperature, but she still carried herself with quiet dignity. "You know," he said, stepping closer again, "people who have nothing to hide usually cooperate faster." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before answering. "And people who abuse authority usually mistake fear for respect." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Daniel felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. The teenage boy near the soda machine lowered his phone slowly, eyes moving between the officer and the woman as if he realized he was witnessing something dangerous that had nothing to do with weapons or crime. Outside, headlights slid across the rain-soaked windows as cars passed through the intersection. The storm had become heavier now, wind pushing sheets of water against the glass hard enough to make the windows shake faintly. Daniel crossed his arms. "Let me guess," he said. "You are another activist looking to sue the city?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, her eyes drifted briefly toward the Chicago Police Department patch on his shoulder. There was disappointment in her expression, but somehow no hatred. That unsettled him even more. "I grew up 8 blocks from here," she said quietly. "Back when officers still walked these streets to protect people instead of intimidate them." Daniel smirked again, but it was weaker this time. "Things change." "Yes," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes for the worse." The cashier behind the register suddenly cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Officer Hayes, maybe this is enough." Daniel shot him a cold glance, so sharp the man immediately looked back down at the register screen. Control returned to Daniel for a moment after that. He could still feel it. The room still belonged to him, or at least he thought it did. Then his radio crackled loudly on his shoulder. "Unit 7, report your location." Daniel grabbed the radio quickly, eyes never leaving Evelyn. "Routine stop," he answered. "Nothing important." Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly toward the red folder in her hands. And for the first time, Daniel noticed embossed gold lettering pressed into the corner beneath the rain droplets. Federal Judicial Oversight Division. The words were small, almost hidden under her fingers, but once he saw them, he could not unsee them. A strange heaviness settled into his stomach as Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes back to him and said in the calmest voice he had heard all night, "That depends entirely on how tonight ends, Officer Hayes." Daniel tried to ignore the pressure building behind his ribs, but the gold lettering on the folder kept pulling his attention back like a flashing warning light on a dark highway. Federal Judicial Oversight Division. The words sat there beneath Evelyn Carter's hand while rain pounded the windows harder than before, each drop striking the glass with a hollow ticking sound that seemed to slow the entire store down. He had spent 13 years learning how to stay in control of every room he entered. That was his reputation inside the district. Officer Hayes handled problems. Officer Hayes cleaned up the streets. Officer Hayes never backed down. The younger officers admired him because he always sounded certain, even when he was wrong. Especially when he was wrong. Daniel looked around the Quick Mart and saw the shift happening in real time. The cashier no longer looked nervous for himself. He looked nervous for Daniel. The teenager near the soda machine had quietly started recording again, holding his phone low near his chest. Even the older man by the coffee station had stopped pretending not to listen. Daniel hated rooms like this. Rooms where people started silently questioning him instead of fearing him. He reached toward the red folder suddenly. "Let me see that." Evelyn pulled it back just enough to keep his hand from touching it. The movement was calm, almost effortless, but it landed like an insult. Daniel felt heat rise into his face. "You do not have the authority to seize federal documents without cause," Evelyn said quietly. "Federal?" Daniel repeated with a short laugh that sounded rough around the edges now. "You expect me to believe somebody dressed like this works for the federal government?" Evelyn glanced down briefly at her torn coat. Water still darkened the fabric near the shoulders. The ripped zipper hung crooked under the fluorescent lights. She could have looked embarrassed. Most people would have. Instead, she simply answered, "Authority does not always arrive wearing expensive shoes." The cashier looked away quickly to hide a reaction. Daniel noticed. His jaw tightened. Outside, a city bus rolled past through the storm, tires hissing through puddles deep enough to splash onto the sidewalk. Midnight Chicago carried a certain kind of loneliness in winter. Streetlights reflected across wet asphalt like broken gold lines, and the wind coming through the gaps near the store entrance carried the sharp smell of snow somewhere farther north. Evelyn slowly placed the medicine bottle back into her coat pocket. Daniel watched her hands carefully now. They were not the hands of a criminal. No shaking, no panic, no desperation, just patience. That unsettled him more than anything else tonight. "You said my name appeared in complaints," he said carefully. "What complaints?" Evelyn studied him for a moment before answering. the kind filed by people who were too afraid to believe anyone would listen. The sentence hit harder than Daniel expected because deep down he already knew there were complaints. Not official ones that stuck. Those disappeared. But whispers stayed alive inside neighborhoods. Stories spread quietly through barber shops, apartment stairwells, laundromats, church basements. Officer Hayes was not someone you argued with. Officer Hayes was someone you survived. Daniel folded his arms tighter across his chest. You think you know me because of paperwork? Evelyn shook her head gently. No, I think tonight is showing me exactly who you are. For the first time since entering the store, Daniel did not immediately respond. Somewhere above them, one of the fluorescent bulbs flickered twice, humming softly like an electrical wire under stress. Then the automatic doors slid open behind him, and cold air swept into the store along with two uniformed officers from the district. One of them stopped the moment he saw Evelyn Carter standing there beside the red folder. The color drained from his face instantly. Oh no, he whispered under his breath. The younger officer standing in the doorway looked like he had seen a ghost. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap onto the floor, while cold wind rushed into the Quick Mart behind him, carrying the distant sound of sirens somewhere farther downtown. His partner stopped beside him, confused at first, until his eyes landed on Evelyn Carter and the red folder in her hands. Then his expression changed too. Daniel noticed both reactions immediately. Fear. Real fear. Not the nervous respect rookies usually showed senior officers. This was different. What? Daniel snapped, irritation covering the unease building in his chest. Neither officer answered right away. The younger one swallowed hard before speaking carefully. Lieutenant Morris has been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. Daniel grabbed his shoulder radio again. Static crackled briefly through the speaker before the lieutenant's voice exploded across the store loud enough for everyone to hear. Hayes, where the hell are you? Daniel straightened automatically. South Halstead Quick Mart. A long silence followed. Then came four words that changed the temperature of the room completely. Do not touch her. Daniel felt every pair of eyes shift toward him at once. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Lieutenant, he asked slowly. The voice coming through the radio sounded strained now. Federal representatives are already downtown. You were instructed hours ago that Judge Evelyn Carter arrived in the city tonight. Daniel looked toward Evelyn again. She remained perfectly still beside the medicine aisle, torn coat hanging open slightly where the zipper had split. The fluorescent lights above reflected softly across the silver pen in her hand. She did not look victorious. She did not look angry. That almost made everything worse. Daniel lowered the radio carefully. Judge, he repeated under his breath. The words sounded unnatural in his mouth now, like something too heavy to carry suddenly placed into his hands. The older officer near the doorway shifted uneasily. Sir, he said quietly to Daniel, maybe we should step outside. Daniel ignored him. His pulse had begun pounding hard enough that he could hear it beneath the buzzing ceiling lights. He replayed the last 20 minutes in his mind all at once. The accusation, the torn coat, the crowd watching, the phone cameras, the laughter. Every second that had felt powerful before now pressed down on him like wet concrete. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice soft enough that everyone in the store leaned closer to hear it. I did not come here tonight looking for humiliation, Officer Hayes. Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He realized suddenly that he had spent years mastering intimidation, but almost no time learning what to say after crossing a line he could not uncross. Outside, headlights swept slowly across the front windows as three black government SUVs rolled to a stop beside the curb one after another. The engines stayed running. Their reflections shimmered across the rain-soaked pavement like dark shadows moving through water. Nobody inside the Quick Mart spoke anymore. The automatic doors slid open once again, and two men in dark overcoats stepped inside, their polished shoes carrying tiny drops of rainwater onto the floor. One of them scanned the room calmly before his eyes settled on Evelyn. His posture immediately straightened. Your Honor, he said respectfully. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath him. The title echoed inside his chest louder than the storm outside. Your Honor. The younger customers near the register slowly lowered their phones, suddenly understanding this was no longer just another ugly interaction caught on camera. Something much larger had just entered the room. One of the federal men noticed the torn coat immediately. His eyes moved slowly toward Daniel without a single word, and somehow that silence carried more disappointment than anger ever could. Evelyn looked down briefly at the damaged zipper hanging loose against the fabric before lifting her eyes toward Daniel one final time. "Officer Hayes," she said gently, "I hope for your sake this is not how you treat every citizen when nobody important is watching." Nobody moved after Evelyn spoke. The Quick Mart felt frozen in place beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, while rain continued sliding down the windows in long silver streaks. Daniel Hayes stood near the center aisle with his shoulders stiff, suddenly aware of every tiny sound around him. The refrigerator motors humming near the drinks, water dripping from umbrellas onto the tile floor, the faint clicking noise from somebody nervously tapping their fingernails against a coffee cup near the counter. A few minutes earlier, the room had belonged to him. Now it felt like the walls themselves were quietly judging him. One of the federal agents stepped forward and removed a dark leather glove slowly, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "Judge Carter," he said carefully, "the mayor's office has been informed you were delayed." Evelyn gave a small nod. "I was occupied." The words were calm, but Daniel felt them like pressure against his chest. The younger officers standing near the entrance avoided looking directly at him now. That hurt more than shouting would have. Respect inside the department was built on image. Once cracks appeared, they spread fast. Daniel glanced toward the teenager who had been recording earlier. The boy lowered his phone immediately, but not before Daniel caught the reflection of himself on the screen. He barely recognized the man staring back. What uniform? Tight jaw? Angry eyes covering fear. For the first time in years, he looked small. Evelyn carefully adjusted the torn side of her coat, trying to close the fabric against the cold draft blowing through the automatic doors. One of the federal agents immediately removed his own overcoat and offered it to her. Daniel noticed how naturally respect surrounded her. Nobody hesitated. Nobody questioned her authority. She had never raised her voice once all night, yet the entire atmosphere shifted around her presence alone. That realization unsettled him deeply. Lieutenant Morris suddenly stormed into the store from the rain outside, breathing hard from rushing across the parking lot. His gray hair was soaked at the edges, and frustration covered his face the second he saw Daniel standing there beside Evelyn Carter. "Hayes," he snapped under his breath. "What were you thinking?" Daniel instinctively straightened. "Lieutenant, I did not know who she was." The answer sounded weak even before it finished leaving his mouth. Evelyn looked toward him quietly. "That is exactly the problem." Silence followed again. Lieutenant Morris rubbed one hand across his face before turning toward Evelyn. "Your Honor, on behalf of the department, I apologize for this unacceptable situation." Evelyn studied him carefully. "Lieutenant, I did not return to Chicago searching for apologies." Her voice stayed soft, but every word carried weight. "I came because too many people filed complaints that disappeared before anyone investigated them." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He suddenly remembered every face he had dismissed over the years. Every citizen he assumed nobody would believe. Every moment he used authority carelessly because he thought consequences only happened to other people. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere above the city skyline. The windows shook faintly beneath the storm. One of the federal agents opened the red folder at last, revealing neatly organized reports secured with color-coded tabs. Daniel caught brief glimpses of names, dates, badge numbers, complaint summaries. His own name appeared more than once. The sight drained the remaining confidence from his expression. Lieutenant Morris noticed too. His face darkened immediately. "Daniel," he said quietly now, no longer sounding angry but tired. "Tell me this woman is wrong." Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came. Because for the first time in a very long time, he was standing in a room where power could not protect him from the truth. The storm finally began to weaken around 1:30 in the morning, but the air inside the Quick Mart still felt heavy enough to stop people from breathing normally. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Customers who should have gone home 20 minutes earlier remained standing quietly beside shelves of chips and cold medicine, as if they understood they had witnessed the moment a powerful man stopped feeling untouchable. Daniel Hayes stood near the coffee station now, no longer at the center of the room, but pushed to its edge without anyone physically moving him there. The federal agent spoke quietly with Lieutenant Morris near the entrance while rainwater slowly dried across the floor beneath their shoes. Evelyn Carter sat alone, near the window beside a small table usually used by late-night customers drinking coffee during winter storms. Someone had offered her a fresh coat from one of the SUVs outside, but she politely refused. Instead, she kept wearing the torn gray one Daniel had damaged earlier. The broken zipper still hung crooked beneath the pale fluorescent lights. Daniel noticed she had taken a small sewing kit from her bag. Nothing expensive, just a tiny silver needle and white thread wrapped around a piece of cardboard. Her fingers moved slowly through the torn fabric while the rest of the room remained almost completely silent. Daniel could not stop watching her. Every pull of the thread felt strangely heavier than the accusations sitting inside the federal folder. She was repairing something he had ruined, and somehow she was doing it without anger. That unsettled him more deeply than punishment ever could. The younger officer near the entrance finally walked over to Daniel quietly. "You should probably head back to the district," he murmured carefully. Daniel barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on Evelyn's hands. The needle moved carefully through the damaged cloth while tiny drops of melted rainwater still glimmered near the cuffs of her sleeves. She looked tired now. Not weak, just tired in the way people become after carrying disappointment for too many years. Outside the window, Chicago traffic moved slowly through wet streets reflecting red brake lights across the pavement like streaks of liquid fire. A city bus hissed to a stop beneath the street lamp across the avenue, releasing a cloud of steam into the freezing air before disappearing again into the night. Daniel suddenly remembered something his father once told him when he first joined the police academy. A badge does not change who a man is. It only reveals him faster. Back then, Daniel thought strength meant control, loudness, fear, compliance. Nobody had ever taught him the difference between authority and dignity. Evelyn pushed the needle carefully through the final tear in the coat and tied the thread with slow precision. The room remained so quiet Daniel could hear the soft pull of fabric against fabric. Then she placed the sewing kit back into her bag and looked out through the rain-covered glass for several long seconds before speaking without turning around. "Do you know what frightened me most tonight, Officer Hayes?" Daniel swallowed hard. "What?" Her reflection shimmered faintly in the dark window beside the storm outside. "Not you." The answer landed softly, but it hollowed something inside him. Evelyn finally turned toward him then, her eyes calm but impossibly sad. It was how normal this felt to everyone else in the room. Daniel lowered his gaze immediately. He could not argue with her because he had seen it too. The cashier staying silent. Customers pretending not to notice. Nervous laughter when humiliation became entertainment. Nobody stepping forward until power changed sides. The realization settled over him slowly, cold as the winter wind outside. Lieutenant Morris approached quietly from behind and placed a folded document into Daniel's hand. "Administrative leave pending investigation." Daniel stared at the paper without reacting. Somewhere above them, the fluorescent light flickered softly again while Evelyn pulled the torn coat closed around herself and stood to leave, carrying the repaired damage with more grace than he had carried authority. The rain had almost stopped by the time Evelyn Carter stepped out of the Quick Mart, leaving behind only a cold mist drifting through the yellow streetlights along South Halsted Avenue. The black government SUVs waited quietly at the curb with their engines humming low in the freezing night air, exhaust rising into the darkness like pale smoke. Daniel Hayes remained inside near the front windows, unable to move for several seconds after watching her walk away. The administrative leave notice still hung loosely in his hand. The paper felt heavier now than his badge ever had. Through the glass, he watched Evelyn pause beside the nearest SUV while one of the federal agents opened the door for her respectfully. She thanked him softly before stopping again to glance back toward the store. Not at the cameras, not at the lieutenant, at Daniel. Their eyes met through rain-streaked glass and fluorescent reflections. Daniel expected anger this time, maybe disgust, but what he saw instead unsettled him far more deeply. Pity. Evelyn gave the smallest shake of her head before stepping into the vehicle. Then the door closed quietly, sealing warmth and silence inside, while Daniel remained standing beneath the harsh lights of the convenience store he had once controlled so easily. Lieutenant Morris exhaled heavily beside him. "Do you understand what happened here tonight?" Daniel stared at the wet pavement outside. "I made a mistake." Morris looked tired enough to age 10 years in one night. "No, Daniel. A mistake is forgetting paperwork. A mistake is missing a radio call. What happened tonight came from somewhere deeper. Daniel did not answer, because deep down, he knew the lieutenant was right. The federal SUVs slowly pulled away from the curb, their headlights sweeping across the windows before disappearing into the sleeping city. Only after they vanished did the customers inside the Quick Mart begin quietly gathering their things to leave. Nobody spoke much. The teenager with the phone slipped out first, avoiding eye contact completely. The cashier finally began wiping down counters with trembling hands, even though they were already clean. The room itself felt different now, stripped bare somehow. Daniel removed his police cap slowly and stared at the dark reflection of himself in the front window. Without the authority in his posture, he suddenly looked older, smaller. Just another tired man standing alone under cheap fluorescent lights after midnight. Lieutenant Morris placed one hand on his shoulder briefly before walking toward the exit. Internal Affairs will contact you in the morning. Then he left too. Daniel stood there listening to the refrigerator's hum for a long time after everyone else was gone. Eventually his eyes drifted downward toward the torn thread still hanging from Evelyn's repaired coat seam in his memory. He could still picture her sitting quietly by the window, sewing damaged fabric together while he stood there unable to repair anything inside himself. That image followed him harder than any accusation in the federal file. Outside, the storm clouds finally began breaking apart above Chicago. A pale slice of moonlight appeared between the buildings, reflecting softly across puddles left behind on the street. Daniel stepped outside at last, and the cold air hit his face immediately. For the first time in years, nobody greeted him with respect when he walked past. No nods, no nervous smiles, just silence. As he reached his patrol car, he noticed something tucked beneath the windshield wiper. A folded receipt from the Quick Mart. Confused, he opened it carefully under the streetlight. Only one sentence had been written across the back in neat blue ink. The law means nothing if mercy disappears from the people enforcing it. Daniel stared at the handwriting for a long moment, while winter wind moved quietly through the empty avenue. Then slowly, for the first time that night, he lowered his head in shame. 3 weeks later, the city no longer spoke about anything else. News vans lined the streets outside police headquarters from sunrise until late evening, while reporters repeated the same phrases over and over across television screens inside diners, laundromats, barbershops, and apartment living rooms all across Chicago. Federal Review. Civil Rights Investigation. Internal Corruption Inquiry. Daniel Hayes heard those words everywhere now. He heard them while standing in grocery store lines where strangers suddenly recognized his face. He heard them from old neighbors who stopped conversations when he walked by. He heard them in the silence from former co-workers who no longer returned his calls. The city that once stepped aside for him now watched him from a distance with quiet suspicion. Daniel sat alone most nights inside his small apartment on the west side, unable to escape the sound of the Quick Mart zipper tearing open in his memory. It replayed constantly. Sharp. Humiliating. Permanent. He had spent years convincing himself he was protecting the city from dangerous people. But now, after reading the complaints collected inside Evelyn Carter's federal files, he began noticing something terrifying. Most of the people who feared him had never threatened him at all. They had simply been vulnerable. A tired father arguing about a parking citation. A teenager walking home too late. A homeless veteran refusing to move fast enough. An exhausted nurse crying after a double shift. Faces he barely remembered now returned to him one by one late at night, when sleep refused to come. The investigation moved quickly after that night at the Quick Mart. Body camera footage surfaced. Witness statements multiplied. Old complaints that once disappeared suddenly reopened under federal review. Daniel attended the hearings in silence, sitting beneath cold courtroom lights while attorneys spoke calmly about conduct, accountability, and abuse of authority. But none of it hit him as hard as seeing Evelyn Carter enter the courtroom each morning carrying the same repaired gray coat folded neatly over one arm. She never wore it. She simply carried it. Like a reminder. Like evidence that dignity could survive humiliation without becoming cruelty itself. One afternoon after a hearing ended, Daniel remained seated long after everyone else stood to leave. The courtroom had nearly emptied when Evelyn quietly approached the defense table alone. Sunlight from the high courthouse windows stretched across the polished wooden floor between them. Daniel looked older now than he had a month earlier. Exhaustion sat heavily beneath his eyes. "Your Honor," he said carefully, struggling to maintain eye contact. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn studied him silently for a moment. "You owe many people one." Daniel lowered his head. "I know." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. Evelyn placed the gray coat gently on the empty chair beside him. The repaired seam was nearly invisible now except for one uneven white stitch near the collar. "Do you know why I kept this?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "Because this coat reminds me how easy it is for power to damage someone in seconds." Her fingers rested lightly against the repaired fabric. "But it also reminds me that damaged things do not have to become hateful things." Daniel felt something tighten painfully in his throat. Evelyn could have destroyed him publicly. She could have humiliated him the same way he humiliated her. Instead, she offered him something he had not expected from anyone anymore. A chance to understand what he had become before it was too late to change. The courtroom lights hummed quietly above them while snow began falling outside the tall courthouse windows, covering Chicago in soft white silence. By early spring, the city had already moved on to newer headlines, newer scandals, newer storms. Chicago always did. Snow melted from the sidewalks. Construction crews returned to the streets before sunrise. Trains rattled above downtown tracks every morning while thousands of people hurried beneath them carrying coffee cups and unfinished conversations into another ordinary day. But some moments did not disappear with the news cycle. Some stayed alive quietly inside the people changed by them. Daniel Hayes no longer wore a badge. The investigation ended with his resignation 2 months earlier after multiple complaints were officially sustained under federal review. The newspapers called it accountability. Former officers called it disgrace. Daniel himself stopped calling it anything at all. He spent most mornings now working maintenance at a small church on the south side, repairing broken railings, repainting classrooms, clearing winter debris from sidewalks before elderly members arrived for Sunday service. It was quiet work, honest work. Nobody saluted him there. Nobody feared him there either. And strangely, that silence began teaching him more than authority ever had. One cold April morning, Daniel stood outside the church tightening loose bolts on a bench near the entrance while soft wind carried the smell of rain through the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere down the block on their way to school. Traffic moved steadily through puddles left behind by an overnight storm. As Daniel wiped grease from his hands with an old towel, a black government sedan slowed near the curb across the street. He froze immediately when the passenger door opened. Evelyn Carter stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a cream-colored coat and dark gloves, sunlight catching softly against silver strands in her hair. Daniel noticed instantly that she no longer carried the damaged gray coat with her. For some reason, that mattered to him. Evelyn thanked the driver quietly before crossing the street alone. Daniel stood there awkwardly beside the half-repaired bench, unsure whether he deserved to speak first. Evelyn glanced toward the church building, then toward the fresh paint cans near the entrance steps. "You stayed in Chicago," she said softly. Daniel nodded once. "I thought about leaving." "But you did not." "No." The wind moved gently through the trees above them, carrying loose petals from nearby flower beds across the sidewalk. Daniel looked older now, but calmer somehow. The anger that once tightened every movement inside him seemed exhausted at last. He hesitated before speaking again. "I read every complaint," he admitted quietly. "Every single one." Evelyn studied his face carefully. "And?" Daniel looked down at his roughened hands. "I spent years believing respect could be forced." He swallowed hard. "Turns out fear only creates silence." Evelyn remained quiet for several seconds while distant church bells echoed softly somewhere farther downtown. Then she reached into her handbag and removed something small wrapped carefully in white cloth. Daniel stared in surprise as she unfolded it slowly. The tiny silver sewing needle from that night inside the Quick Mart glimmered briefly beneath the morning light. "I think this belongs to you now," she said. Daniel looked confused. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Because repairing damage is harder than causing it." She placed the needle gently into his palm before stepping back toward the waiting sedan. Daniel stood motionless beside the church steps while spring wind moved through the empty street around them. He looked down at the small silver needle resting against his hand, barely weighing anything at all, yet somehow heavier than the badge he once carried across his chest every day. When he finally lifted his eyes again, Evelyn Carter was already driving away beneath the pale Chicago sunlight, While church bells continued ringing softly through the city, she never stopped believing could become better.